Let me introduce our first speakers for the first panel, and I'm delighted that Maria Eliza Cevasco is joining us today. Many in Brazil will know of her work well, and many in the UK know of Maria's work too. She's the author of Para Ler Raymond Williams.
Very good.
Reading Raymond Williams, which is clearly from what everyone tells me, is kind of the fundamental study on Raymond Williams in Brazil, a text that everyone turns to. Professor Cevasco is a professor of English and Cultural Studies at the University of Sao Paulo. It was a real honor for me to share a session with her in Campinas, not long before the COVID. It was in 2019, wasn't it? And then this year, Alexandro has arranged a Zoom conference in August where we again were able to share ideas together. So it's a real pleasure. Croeso cynnes iawn, Maria. A very warm welcome to us here in a virtual Swansea. And let me pass the reins over to you.
Thank you very much, Daniel and fellow panelists. I want, of course, to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me to take part in this commemoration celebration of Raymond Williams' centenary. I'm getting really sentimental over Williams. It might be old age, who knows, right? But I'm getting sentimental over Williams. And the other day I was invited by Emily Traher. Do you know her, Daniel? She said you had recommended me. And I wrote a piece for Planet. And, I said, I wrote that. And I said, well, what I really want to talk about is about my Raymond Williams, right? What Raymond Williams means to me, right? So, and I think Williams has this characteristic that people have not only an intellectual admiration for him, but also some sort of emotional bond. I myself cannot teach culture is ordinary without weeping, right? And I have taught it many, many times, but tears come to my eyes when I listen to a voice saying culture is ordinary, culture is ordinary. And this is particularly incredible to say and listen to in a country as unequal as Brazil, right? Where education is far from ordinary. So when thinking about what to say today, I was tempted to share my Raymond Williams with all of you, beginning with sharing a story that Hugo knows because he helped me translate it into Portuguese for a dossier we are preparing on Williams' centenary. And it's a story that Francis Mohan, who is another Williamsite, he printed this story in a text that he delivered in 1988, right after Raymond Williams's death. And I think this story encapsulates a lot of what is interesting to talk about today in a presentation entitled What We Can Still Learn from Williams Today, which is the title I gave, right? So the story is the following. I'll read it. An institution is at work. Its members assembled to consider options, arrive at judgments, make decisions. It's probably an academic committee, but it might equally be an editorial conference at the BBC or a debate in Parliament. There are proposals, comments, suggestions, counter-proposals. The room is alive with reasonable, constructive discourse. But then another voice is added, perhaps unexpected, perhaps confusing, at all events unwelcome. You can't say that, some authority declares, for what has been added is not merely false, perhaps not false at all, but fundamentally out of context, out of register, out of order. It's simple. Whichever words are chosen for emphasis, you can't say that. And now back to business. But no, even before sensible people have finished nodding their agreement, the awkward voice is raised again. But that's what I came here to say, right? So Williams told and retold this story many times, according to Francis Mulhern. And I think, and we all know, that's Williams cites, that one of the collection of essays published after his death is precisely entitled What I Came to Say. And I think that's exactly the import of Williams's work, that he came to say things that were offensive or worrying or oppositional to a lot of people. This story also, highlights for me the reaction of the academic establishment to Williams, and even, if we may confess, in ourselves, cultural workers who try to follow in his steps. You might be puzzled and say, why does that disturb us? Because, of course, Williams left us a legacy of responsibility and commitment that we are not always ready to accomplish, right? Sometimes it's very difficult to follow his integrity, his intellectual honesty, and the way he deals with complex things. So I think that one of his quotes that I keep repeating everywhere I go summarizes what I'm trying to talk about with this commitment that he asks us, this responsibility and he expects from intellectuals who work in the humanities. And I think many of you can repeat with me the words, which is there are ideas and ways of thinking. Carla knows already how to continue. There are ideas and ways of thinking with the seeds of life in them. And there are others, perhaps deep in our minds, with the seeds of a general death. Our measure of success in recognizing these kinds and in naming them, making possible their common recognition, may be literally the measure of our future. So that is Raymond Williams's task, the task he asks us to perform. So we must be able to recognize the ideas with the seeds of life and distinguish them from the ideas with the seeds of a general death. And nowadays, Daniel was talking about the pandemic. It's very clear that, especially in countries like Brazil, ideas with the seeds of death actually caused the death of 600,000 people, right? And some of us could recognize that they were the ideas with the seeds of death in them, but we were not able to confront them. We were not able to do something about it, right? We were left with our despair, right? Which is something Williams would not have accepted. So having said why he challenges us, I want to talk a little bit about how I forgot to look at the time. How long have I been speaking, Daniel? I don't want to pass the time, 15, 10, 5 minutes?
5 minutes so far, Maria, you're fine.
Okay, no, I just want to, I forgot to look. I like to keep track of the time. So anyway, I was talking about, the task he left for us who follow him, and the tasks and the other things that, what else he came to say, right? And who else he came to confront, and who else he came to disturb, right? And of course, the first group of people he came to disturb are academics, right? So Williams confronted the academia that he found. We all know that he was a teacher at the Workers' Education Association, but also a Cambridge Don, right? But he confronted the academic establishment with a new conception of culture and a demonstration of how elitist and conservative the practices in the humanities normally are. You will remember that when William started his career and he started setting up cultural studies, he confronted the most powerful intellectual project in the humanities in the UK, which was Cambridge English, which was impersonated in F.R. Leavis. And amazingly, Williams destroyed bit by bit everything that Leavis defended, because he immediately saw through, as I said, the elitism and the conservatism of Leavis's position. Even though Williams, as I say jokingly to my students, he's not a bad guy, right? He's not the bad guy. He's not the villain in the film, right? He is just a man who translates hegemonic ideas into the practice of the humanities. Everything is fine as long as we don't disturb the order, as long as we don't say what we came here to say, to go back to William's story. And what was it that was so important for Leavis? For Leavis, the important thing, the role of the humanities was to continue the project of Matthew Arnold, who is the father of literary criticism, and I come from literature, right? And he said that culture was sweetness and light, right? You have to tell the ones who are excluded from culture why they are in the dark and in the bitter side of life, not in the sweet side of life, right? And also, Leavis said that the role of the humanities was to preserve the tradition. And Williams came up with one of his most interesting concepts. He was a great inventor of new categories for making us think culture, right? And he coined this expression, which I love, which is selective tradition. So tradition is not tradition, right? As Leavis thought it was. It's not something that passes on from one generation to the other. Oh, how beautiful, right? We pass it from one generation to the other, but it is something that has been selected for precise reasons. I mean, all of us who work in the academia can think of what most of our colleagues would say to our proposals of dismantling the disciplines we teach, right? And introducing novelties, introducing new ways, and oh, horror, including students and working for a democratic education, right? That is unthinkable, right? Because it really challenges our role as powerful academics. I find it's ridiculous that academics like ourselves think of ourselves as powerful, right? So, but anyway, that's what most people think. I don't know if my colleagues agree with me, but that's my impression, and that's what I learned from what Williams came to say. Now, the second group that he disturbed, the second group that would like to say to Williams, you can't say that, right? This second group, believe it or not, we leftists don't like very much to talk about it, but it was orthodox Marxism, right? Williams established a new way for Marxism to work with culture, which was directly confrontational to orthodox Marxism, very much starting from the basic tenet of the base determines the superstructure, right? Which was already in the 19th century, Marx wrote that. But it's not Marx's fault, right? I mean, he was not a cultural critic, and what he was trying to fight against was the idea that the superstructure and culture, which is of course part of the superstructure, was autonomous from society. But with time, this notion became very fixed and rigid. So Raymond Williams said, listen, we have to reevaluate base, determine, and superstructure, right? The base, which is economic relations and the relations of production, should be reevaluated in terms of process, because men and women not only produce material goods, but they produce themselves, right? Of course, as Marx would say, not in conditions of their own choosing, right? Determine has to be rethought in terms of exerting pressures and imposing limits. We all know that we cannot think beyond the limits of our social historical situation. And superstructure has to be redefined in terms of also a process which is much more, and I'm sorry to be repeating the word basic, but that's what Williams does, which is very basic. Superstructure is very basic as well, in the sense that it's so fundamental, it's so determining in our lives, particularly in our age, which is the age of culture, right? Which is the age in which Frederick Jameson famously defined our time, saying that the logic of late capitalism is cultural, right? The logic is cultural. So therefore, when we work with culture, we are working in a central sphere of contemporary life. So this is to sum up what Williams has said about the tradition, about what his followers should do, and about cultural materialism, which is the name he gave to this new position he founded in Marxist cultural theory. Well, very well. But then I think that especially when we confront our time with, the increasing commodification of all things, very much including knowledge and all that, that perhaps what we can still learn and work for when thinking of Williams is the notion of human value. For Williams, human value is a central tenet of his thoughts. I find that in the reaction of my students when I teach Raymond Williams, including that quote I gave you about the seeds of life and the seeds of a general death, that they all react to it in a positive way. And it is at those moments that I think that the overwhelming dominance of exchange value over all forms of life in late capitalism has not yet succeeded in extirpating all notions of human value. It's the moment in which you can see a new generation reacting to Williams in such a positive way, right? I don't know if my other colleagues who also teach Williams have the same experience, right? That when you teach Williams, the students respond to this notion of human value, which is so debased in our time. So I think I'm proposing here, and I'm very worried about the time, I'm proposing here that human value should be added as another of Raymond Williams's keywords, right? In that essay I told you about, that I commented that I can't teach cultures ordinary without weeping. There is a quote in which Raymond Williams proudly says that he proudly tells us about the way of living of his working class Welsh family. So I couldn't resist quoting that in a seminar, which at least virtually is taking place in Wales. And I said, and I read, right? So my point in reading this is not only, thinking of Wales, but also trying to show to you the ways in which Raymond Williams links practical life and the task of the intellectual. So he says, my grandfather, a big, hard laborer, wept while he spoke finally and excitedly. Remember, Raymond Williams was also a writer. So the use of words are very important, says the literature teacher in me, right? But it's this. My grandfather, a big, hard laborer, wept while he spoke finally and excitedly. So a laborer can speak finally. Culture is ordinary. At a parish meeting of being turned out of his cottage. So here, I'll read again the quote, right? I know I'm interrupting it to highlight, but I'll read it again. So turned out of his cottage. So here is the social preoccupation, right? The ways in which social life enters the picture. My father, not long before he died, spoke quietly and happily of when he had started a trade union branch and a Labour Party group in the village, politics. And without bitterness, that is what I really envy in Williams's father, without bitterness. These days, it's a bit difficult to talk about politics without bitterness, right? Of the capped man of the new politics. I'm going to read again everything that I read, interrupting, right? So that you can have a feel of the whole thing. I haven't finished yet this quote. My grandfather, a big, hard laborer, wept while he spoke, finally and excitedly, at a parish meeting of being turned out of his cottage. My father, not long before he died, spoke quietly and happily of when he had started a trade union branch and a Labour Party group in the village, and without bitterness of the capped man of the new politics. Now comes what Williams came to say. I, Raymond Williams, speak another language, but I think of the same things. You see what the meaning of culture is ordinary? So the questions, says Williams, that I ask about culture, right, are questions about the general purposes of a society. So you could see the social historical conditions, his grandfather being turned out of his cottage. You could see the political situation, his father talking about the changes in the Labour Party that took the Labour Party away from the tenets of what Williams believed in, which was socialism, right? And the academic who speaks the same language, but thinks of the same things. So that is what Raymond Williams brings to academic life, this notion that the fundamental center of our work is precisely how we promote human value and what we think of human value. This is right behind what Raymond Williams accomplished, right, as an academic and particularly as a socialist. At times in which we can think of anything except of a change in our social life. And a famous quote that runs in many studies these days, that some people attribute to Frederick James, something to Zizek. And they say, well, Nowadays, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of our capitalist way of life. So change has become an impossibility in our times, right? We live in the times of sameness, that everything will continue to be exactly as it is. And Williams lived and promoted a time of change. So what can we do these days? I said, what can we still learn from Williams these days when the social historical conditions are so different from his, right? I think we have to learn from Williams that our work can still make a difference and that we can contribute politically to socialism, right? This much maligned word these days. I don't know in England, but in Brazil, I mean, the great political fear is that communism is going to sweep over the country, right? Which is completely ridiculous. But anyway, so it's a time in which we who have our hearts in the right place should defend socialism more than ever. And I would like to recommend one of Williams's texts, which is called Towards Many Socialisms, right? Notice the S, right? So nobody knows what socialism will be like. That would be authoritarian. Can you see the parties, the leftist parties, absolutely mad at Williams? I can imagine a meeting of the communist, of the leftist parties anywhere, you know, and he raising his hand and saying something, and everybody say, "You can't say that," right? Because that's exactly what he would say, right? I mean, even in Cultures Ordinary, he talks about the Communist Party in Britain, and he says the idea, I can't remember the exact words, but he says the idea that you can think of yourself and your ideas as the future is crazy, right? Nobody knows what the future will be, right? We have to plant the seeds of life and see which ones will grow, which will not, right? And I want to finish, okay, Daniel? Yeah, am I still in time? Do I still have time?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, you're fine.
All right. So I would like to finish by remembering one of Raymond Williams' most daring propositions, which is the title of a book he published in 1961, which is The Long Revolution, right? The Long Revolution is a contradiction in terms, right? You agree with that? Revolutions, whoa, right? Revolution, everything changed. And Williams proposes a long revolution. And he says that the only way we can contribute to the long revolution, if we want to contribute to the long revolution, if you are all very happy with the way the world is, be my guest, right? Wait for destruction, right? It will come very, very soon, right? But if you want to contribute to the long revolution, the long revolution is a revolution against hegemony, against the dominant way of thinking. Remember Marx, again, the dominant ideas are the ideas of the dominant class. That is hegemony, right? It is the ideas, ways of thinking, ways of feeling, right? Whose intention is to keep up the power of a particular class. Right, all the academics here know that Williams used hegemony quite a lot, that he took it from Antonio Gramsci, and but it's fundamental to think that the long revolution is against hegemony, and it must be fought in every strand of our life, very much including the way we teach. The other day, I read a very interesting project by one of Alexandre's students, and Yasmin. And she said something that I found very, very interesting, that Raymond Williams defended in his book Communications, which is not well known, right? That you have to teach a method. You don't have to teach criticism, you have to teach discussion. So your method should be a method of discussion. So, my dear friends, the long revolution is to be fought in all our activities, including the way we teach, the way we present panels at an event like that, the way we organize our teaching programs, the way we live, the ways we live in our neighborhood, the ways in which we act with our friends, with our family, those of us who have children, the way we raise our children. All this is part of the long revolution, and particularly education, working with culture. You know that culture is the machine that makes subjectivities, right? It's a machine that is designed to making subjectivities, very much including our unconscious, right? We have a psychoanalyst listening to us here, and I don't know, but I mean, our conscious is also shaped by the hegemonic idea. So we have to think of ways of opposing the hegemonic ideas and of fighting for an emergent new world that I hope will be very much what Williams came to say. Thank you. I didn't sing today, Daniel.
Thank you, Maria. Characteristically wide-ranging and spirited, even if you didn't sing. I am disappointed at that, but...
Well, the session hasn't finished yet.
No, there's always time. Absolutely. Thank you so much. No, we're fine with time. I've tried to give enough time so that we can actually have some discussion as well. But we'll listen to Hugo first and then discuss both papers together. Is that okay?
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you very much. So Hugo, came to join us in Swansea. We've been twice, haven't you, Hugo, to research with us at CREW, which is the Centre for Research into the English Literature and Language of Wales, in which, of course, Raymond Williams plays a central role, actually as a novelist, quite as much as a critic. And it was moving to hear you reading some of the more autobiographical passages, Maria, not least in relation to his grandfather and his father, very sort of patriarchal lineage, which we might discuss later, but still very powerful and very moving. Hugo sat in on some of our sessions, and Carla likewise a few years later, and it's always particularly enriching for us to have an international array of people exploring Wales and responding to what's going on in Wales and the history of Wales. One of those areas of darkness for Matthew Arnold was actually Welsh-speaking Wales, and as Her Majesty's Inspector of Schools, as Arnold was, he was actually in a position to eradicate indigenous languages in the spread of the sweetness and light of Anglophone culture, which was sort of democratic on one hand and profoundly colonialist on the other. And Raymond Williams does emerge in some ways from some of the tensions within Welsh culture in that sense. And those tensions, of course, periphery and core, speak to a much wider world as well. So Hugo has completed his PhD recently. Congratulations, Dr. Rivetti, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today. He studied social sciences at the Universidade de Sao Paulo, where he also did his master's degree and PhD with some sojourns, as I said, in Swansea. Hugo's going to talk to us today about the politics of place, Raymond Williams in the 21st century. Over to you, Hugo.
Thank you, Daniel. Before I start, I will just try to share my screen with you all. Let's see if it works. Right. Can you see this?
Yes. Yeah, perfect. It works.
Okay. All right. All right. So thank you so much, Daniel, for having me in this symposia, and I would like to compliment you and Eve for the initiative to organize and put together this event. It's a privilege for me to share these sessions with my dear colleagues and friends from Brazil, and especially with you, Daniel, with whom I've learned so much during my stays in Swansea. I made dear friends there, and also with Maria Eliza, which is a central reference for the studies of Raymond Williams in Brazil. So I've prepared the text, and I will read it so I can stick to our timetable. The history of the British left in the 60s and 70s was deeply influenced by the debate opposing the first New Left, those who started the movement in the mid-50s, like Raymond Williams, E.P. Thompson, Stuart Hall, John Saville, and Ralph Miliband, to the second New Left, the group which took charge of the New Left Review after the split of the first editorial board, headed by Perry Anderson, Tom Nairn, Robin Blackburn, and Anthony Barnett. This debate revolved more generally on the history of British society and socialism and the political and theoretical status of Marxism in Britain. Today, I would like to begin my presentation by referring to one particular aspect of these debates. It has to do with the second generation's critique of its predecessors as representatives not of an English Marxism, but of leftist forms of populism. The significance of this critique appears in this quote from a text by Perry Anderson. Its almost complete failure to offer any structural analysis of British society is striking. Instead of a systematic sociology of British capitalism, it tended to rely on a simplistic rhetoric in which the common people, ordinary men and women, were opposed to the interests, establishment, etc. Described as humanist, the idiom was, in fact, populist and pre-socialist. It represented a major failure of nerve and intelligence, an inability to name things as they were. This immense hiatus automatically made the New Left's ambition to furnish a new socialist synthesis impossible. According to Anderson, this deficiency of the first New Left would derive from a peculiar aspect of the English working class, that is, a corporate class consciousness that would restrict its political action to defensive attitudes, placing much more value on the maintenance of already accomplished social improvements rather than on the revolution of society in its entirety. I wanted to highlight this aspect of the debate because it points to important elements of Williams's political thinking and socialist theory, elements that testify to Williams's place as a crucial reference for socialist politics in the beginning of the 21st century. To begin with, let's turn into Williams's idea of class. For Williams, to be part of a class does not entail, necessarily and immediately, to see oneself as part of this class and even to act according to this conscience. That is why not every class can engender, according to him, effective political action. Let's take a look at this passage from Culture and Society. Class feeling is a mode rather than a uniform possession of all the individuals who might, objectively, be assigned to that class. When we speak, for instance, of a working class idea, we do not mean that all working people possess it, or even approve of it. We mean rather that this is the essential idea embodied in the organizations and institutions which that class creates. The working class movement as a tendency rather than all working class people as individuals. It is foolish to interpret individuals in rigid class terms, because class is a collective mode and not a person. At the same time, in the interpretation of ideas and institutions, we can speak properly in class terms. Hence, Williams's stress on the crucial political role played by the British labour movement's institutions. After all, it is through these institutions and organizations that working class ideas and values, which define its way of life, are shaped. According to Williams, the working class, because of its position, has not, since the Industrial Revolution, produced a culture in the narrower sense. The culture which it has produced, and which it is important to recognize, is the collective democratic institution, whether in the trade unions, the cooperative movement, or a political party. Working class culture in the stage through which it has been passing is primarily social, in that it has created institutions rather than individual, in particular intellectual or imaginative work. When it is considered in context, it can be seen as a very remarkable creative achievement. This broader political principle illuminates, for instance, Williams's affiliation to the Labour Party between 1961 and 66, when most of his contemporaries from the first New Left had already broken with it, and also his tireless efforts to change, rather than just dismiss, the party and its institutions, as he tried to do through many political experiments, like the May Day Manifesto, the National Convention of the Left, SYRA, and the Socialist Society. It also relates to Williams' stand on reformism. Although he rejected the reformist and revisionist thesis that took over the Labour Party from the late 50s onwards, Williams made a distinction between two kinds of reformism: the one that does not aim to transform the existing social order, and the other that acknowledges the importance of specific reforms as means to do it. This distinction shows how complex Williams's politics and theory are, because the belief on the possibility of a radical transformation of reality coexists in his work and militancy with the rather realistic conscience that one cannot ignore the importance of reformist politics as an effective way to act in the conditions given in parliamentary democracies like Britain's. It is this twofold consciousness that pervades Williams' effort to connect the idea of long revolution to the notion of revolution in its tragic sense attempted in modern tragedy. Though Williams reaffirms here his concept of a long revolution, stressing its radical dimension, he also focuses on how this process appears in reality, arguing that political revolutions, events caused by violence and suffering, are part of a general human revolution aiming at the incorporation of all its people as whole human beings. A similar emphasis on the human can be found in Williams's idea of a common culture. As he stressed in different moments, a common culture is not an extension of working class culture. It can only be produced by the action of the whole people in conditions where it can act freely and with free access to the means of communication, information, and education. Hence, Williams's stand on the debate regarding communication politics, a topic of interest throughout his life. Opposing to the alternatives at hand, the authoritarian, paternalistic, and commercial systems, Williams stands for what he calls a democratic system. We have to discover a system which is certainly the opposite of commercialism, but which is certainly also quite the opposite of state control. We have to think of ways which would truly disperse the control of communication and to truly open the channels of participation. My own view is that we shall have to stop thinking in terms of national systems. We shall certainly have to stop thinking in terms of one ideal national system. Instead, can we apply this simple test? Are the means of expression in any particular case of such a kind that they can be owned by the people who use them? This quote contains many clues to understand the nature of Williams' socialism. Williams aims at a socialist democracy based on wide politics of self-management, of communal, cooperative, and collective institutions in factories, cultural activities, and local political administrations. Williams saw this as the only way for the left to overcome both centralized planning and submission to market forces, and as a result, to build what seemed to him the only socialist alternative, production structured according to the population's necessities and interests. From the plan to the presumed public interest to actual and complex participatory planning. Concerning self-management politics, the main challenge facing socialists by the end of the 20th century was, according to Williams, to set large-scale projects in order to rearrange patterns of ownership and control in wider and more complex economic sectors. With this in mind, Williams argued for the establishment of new kinds of intermediate institutions. The very socialist democracy is taught by him as distinct both from the model of a centralized command economy and from the developing model of an increasingly fragmented self-management. Williams's political project may be defined as populist, but only if by populist we mean democratic. Popular democracy and common ownership. These are the only practical means of genuine social sharing. The link between socialism and popular democracy is literally the key to our future. Yet, if socialism is seriously to carry through the idea of sharing, it has to go beyond the delimited forms of representative political democracy, to move on to real sharing in all the decisions that affect our lives, not by some all-purpose mandate to others, but by direct participation and by accountable delegation, is the historic task of socialist democracy. Hence, the need to pay attention to new forms of representing society's interests through alliances, blocs, coalitions, and to the new political agendas emerging at that time. The peace movement, the ecology movement, the women's movement, solidarity with the third world, human rights agencies, campaigns against poverty and homelessness, campaigns against cultural poverty and distortion. To consider these new agendas and issues was decisive not only as part of the theoretical effort to comprehend the world, but also as part of the socialist project to transform it. The history of world capitalism and the emergence of new forms of social mobilization since Williams's death in 1988 seem to confirm both his historical diagnosis and his notion of a socialist politics. In order to conclude, I would like to refer very briefly to contemporary reflections on what we may call the politics of the common presented in two recent books, Multitude, published in 2004 by the Italian philosopher Toni Negri and the American philosopher Michael Hart, and Common, published in 2015 by the French philosopher Pierre Dardot and the French sociologist Christian Laval. Although Williams does not figure as a theoretical influence for these authors, it is possible to track significant affinities between them and, thereby, claim Williams's place as a central intellectual reference for those interested in the new forms of political action emerging at the beginning of the century. Despite some divergences, these authors concur in many aspects, also present in Williams's work. To begin with, they are both interested in rehabilitating a radical idea of democracy, which would be the core of any socialist project. Secondly, they both identify the emergence of a new stage of capitalism, empire, according to Negri and Hart, the new neoliberal order, according to Dardot and Laval, in which economic exploitation and political domination are based in a close collaboration between national states, multinational corporations, and transnational organizations. Therefore, they argue, in terms very similar to Williams's, that resistance to capitalism cannot resort to the state, as we can see in this quote from Dardot and Laval. Finally, and similarly to Williams, they identify in autonomous forms of mobilization more democratic, and horizontally organized, the best way to act politically in this new historical configuration. That's the case both of Negri and Hart's multitude and Dardot and Laval's politics of the common. As the process of commodification advanced in the turn of the century, reaching public spaces, natural resources, and scientific research, movements centered in the conditions for life in common, the right to education, to health, housing, and to the common access to natural resources gained growing prominence. In the last decades, Brazil has witnessed the emergence of new forms of social activism and mobilization, which we could argue are based on this principle of the common. I will give just a few examples of movements that are playing a crucial role in the mobilization against Bolsonaro since 2019. There is the MTST, the Portuguese abbreviation for Homeless Workers Movement, founded in 1997, which defines itself as a popular movement fighting in the peripheries for the rights of homeless workers through autonomous initiatives and collective forms of organization and mobilization. There is also CMP, the Portuguese abbreviation for Central of Popular Movements, founded in 1993, which aims to connect different popular movements and their struggles for rights, public policies, and popular participation. And finally, there is the more recent Frente Povo Sem Medo, Front of the People Without Fear, founded in 2015, which also aims to unite movements and activists in order to safeguard a popular platform which would represent not the 99%, not the 1%, a popular platform which would represent the 99% of society and thus contribute to the radicalization of Brazilian democracy. But Brazil is not an isolated case. The Zapatista movement in Chiapas, Mexico, the water war in Bolivia, indigenous movements in Africa and Asia, like the movement for the survival of the Ogoni people in Nigeria, new women's movements in India and Botswana, the World Social Forum, founded in Porto Alegre, south of Brazil in 2001, and which held meetings since then in Bombay, Bamako, Caracas, Nairobi. It is astonishing how Williams's voice can be heard in all these places and movements. This is the voice recorded in a book not accidentally entitled Towards 2000. The sources of a different ethos are then primarily in those other social bonds, those ultimately deeper attachments and purposes which capitalism tries to push into a lower importance or where necessary to cancel. It is then in what happens or can happen in these other practices and relationships that the resources of a wider socialism have to be developed. It is a matter of what happens in the primary care of people, in families and neighborhoods and communities. It is a matter of what happens in the organized services of health and education, in protection and enhancement of our physical environment. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugo. Very interesting. I mean, in a lot of the writing, I guess, on any prominent person, that there often are a set of canonical quotations that are then endlessly recirculated by people. It was quite refreshing to see a whole different set of quotations, especially some of those older ones from Communication and Culture and Society. In some ways, it's the continuity of Raymond Williams's thought that's somewhat striking when you juxtapose some of those quotations against Towards 2000 then later on. So there were some obvious, I think, parallels between the two papers in different ways, not least the centrality of culture in relation to the way you were talking about class, or claiming that Raymond Williams was talking about class, Hugo, which I think is right. So, well, I guess I should open it up to questions. That there were a few things that struck me as interesting. Last week, Werner Sollers, speaking of Cold War Germany, gave a kind of variant of the old saying that a dialect with an army is a language. A socialist with a state is a Stalinist, was the kind of Cold War equivalent. And he was talking about Raymond Williams being important precisely as a democratic socialist, where democracy in some ways was as significant as the socialism. The consequence of that, of course, is that socialists have to deal with defeat, which perhaps leads me to the question here in the Q&A from Alison Oliveira, who says, I'd like to ask both Professors Hugo and Maria Eliza what they think Raymond Williams would have to say about and to Brazil in the 21st century. So maybe I could add to that. And firstly, I mean, what do you think is the status of Raymond Williams? I mean, we're obviously here today discussing Raymond Williams, but is he a figure who's still a presence beyond our selective group in Brazilian academia? Maria, you might want to address that a little bit. And then the question of what he has to say. What do you think he might have to say about Brazil today? Maria Eliza, do you want to go first?
Yes, thank you. First, I would like to congratulate Hugo on a very interesting paper. I was just sorry that for some technical reasons, all your quotes, I couldn't read the end of them. So maybe it was a problem with my setup, but it was very interesting. And as Daniel puts it, it was good to read or reread quotes that do not circulate so widely, right, among the communities, the academic communities that talk about Williams. So Daniel asked me to talk about Daniel Williams, right? Daniel Williams asked me to talk about the presence of Raymond Williams in academia. And, you know, when I wrote my book on Williams, which was first published in Portuguese in 2001, and then in Spanish in 2003, I used to be, I have to confess that, I used to be a bit disappointed, because in the Spanish-speaking world in Latin America, the book was published in Argentina. In all syllabus, that's an exaggeration. In many syllables of postgraduate courses on culture and communications, they quoted Williams and my book on Williams. It was part of the program, whereas in Brazil, nobody seemed to be talking. It's not because of me, nobody seemed to be talking about Williams. And they read my book in Argentina, not because of me, but because of Raymond Williams, right? So, but anyway, in the last 10 years, I don't know, Alexandro and Anderson, and probably Carla and Anna know more than me, but I think in the recent years, I would say in the last 7-8 years, Raymond Williams has acquired an enormous visibility in Brazilian academic circles. A university publisher, Unesp, has published translations of all his books. I think there's not one book, Carla might correct me, are there any books by Williams, except for communications and reading and criticism, that are not translated into Portuguese?
The Long Revolution is not translated yet.
Yeah, you were right, yeah. Because, you know, of course, since I am a professor of English, I have all his books in English, so I ended up by not reading the Brazilian translation. So I would say that Williams has had a revival in Brazil. So I don't know if my colleagues agree with me. And this has to do also with a change in the climate. So because we had for many years leftist governments, which opened up the possibilities for new approaches to education, to politics, to communality. Hugo talked about the series of movements, of social movements that became very visible in Brazil. And I can't resist now telling you all that I first translated Cultures Ordinary for the school of the landless people movement, right? I went to teach a course there and I translated Cultures Ordinary for them. And again, it was incredibly moving to give Cultures Ordinary to laborers, right? They immediately got it, right? It was like, they were conversing with Williams. So I think, we are seeing a revival of Williams. Now, concerning Allison's question about what would Williams have to say to Brazil today, my first impulse was to say he would say, run away. Of course, he wouldn't, right? He wouldn't say, run away, get out as fast as possible. No, he wouldn't say that. But he once said, we have to be very serious about the future because our own input into it will be a consistent part of what it is. So what we're doing here, we are contributing to the future. So instead of run away, I think Raymond Williams would say, start thinking, start working, start organizing, right? Before, he wouldn't say that because he was always hopeful. But I would say before it's too late. That's what I would say. Hugo.
I completely agree with you, Maria Elisa. I think that it's impressive how when we look at Williams's political trajectory path as a militant, a socialist militant, his engagement with many political experiments. So now I remember in the archives, in the Richard Burton archives, there is a copy of a paper talking about the end of the National Convention of the Left and reporting how the different leaders of this initiative were reacting very negatively, bleakly to the end of the convention, and Williams saying that the end of the convention was not a big problem. He was astonished by his associates' reactions, and he said we were just testing the temperature of the water. We have to keep fighting. We have to keep organizing ourselves. And I think we see this when we look at his path as a social activist. And so he would say that keep fighting, keep resisting, and try to find new ways to resist and to organize yourselves. Try to be imaginative, about the presence of Williams today in Brazil, I thought about another aspect of his presence, which relates to a negative aspect of Brazilian political scenario today, which has to do to the fight of Bolsonaro's government in the fields of culture and education. They elected strategically. They elected education and culture as central fields of their cultural struggles between left and right, between this conservative government and what they think they are the enemies of the nation. So I think this puts authors like Paulo Freire and Williams in the center of the debate. And in the case of Williams, regarding the ways he thought about culture and the culture as a material action and also as a political field to fight.
Thank you, Hugo. Yes. I should note that it's also Paulo Freire's centenary this year, and Alexandro's conference was deliberately juxtaposing Williams and Freire, not least the emphasis on education and culture in the work of both. Do please write into the boxes if you have questions to ask. One parallel that was striking me as I was listening to both of you, in a sense, was Hugo, your discussion of class, the distinction from Marx, who I think he picks it up from Hegel, really, between something in itself and for itself, whereas so class in itself is classed as a kind of economic, scientific measurement, so that everyone who earns below a certain level would be working class, whether they're aware of it or not. You know, the measurement of class, if you like, versus class for itself, where the working class, or whatever class, become conscious of their class position, but particularly the working class becoming conscious of its exploitation and therefore mobilizing around that. You know, that shift from in itself to for itself, from science to culture, maybe almost. And I was just thinking that has some resonances with the way Maria Eliza was talking about the selective tradition. You know, any tradition is there in a sense in itself, you know, on the shelves of the library or in some depository, but then it requires a critic to make it a tradition for itself, to mobilize a tradition. That could be a hegemonic tradition, a la Leavis in the way you were describing him, or a sort of counter-hegemonic tradition, as perhaps we encounter in some of Raymond Williams's writings, not least the representation of the working class, but also an essay like the Welsh industrial novel as well, which is kind of literally rediscovering and repackaging, creating a tradition from texts that have been ignored. How does that play out in Brazil, would be my question in a way. Maria Eliza, you're professor of English. You know, what's the nature of English studies at a literary level in Brazil in those terms, in terms of the canon, in terms of what's being taught? And is there a similar question that could be asked of Brazilian literature, of which I know very little, I have to admit?
Well, so do I. I mean, I have been working with English literature the whole of my academic life, so I'm not very proficient to talk about Brazilian literature. So, but concerning the way literature in general is thought of in Brazil, I would say that it has changed a lot in the last 40 years. That I have been teaching at the University of São Paulo for 40 years. So it has changed. We have many courses that do not cover canonical novels. We have we have courses that teach post-colonial literature, and et cetera. But what I really wanted to talk about concerning Williams and the teaching of literature in Brazil are the many similarities that we can find between Williams's way of looking at literature and a central figure in Brazilian cultural criticism, who is Antônio Cândido. Antônio Cândido died at 90, in 2000 and, Alexandre, 2019. You know, this pandemic has affected my perception of the years. But anyway, Antônio Cândido is a central figure in Brazilian literary studies. And if you look at the two of them, the similarities are amazing. I'm not talking about influence. I am sure Cândido himself told me that he had never read Raymond Williams, but, and I doubt very much that Williams read Antônio Cândido, unless he knew Portuguese, because Cândido was very belatedly translated into English. But the position is the same, even theoretically, because you will remember that the way of looking at literature in Raymond Williams is very inventive. in which he said that the crucial theoretical invention that was made in cultural studies was the study of project and formation as two manifestations of the same impulse. So he wanted to say that culture and art and society, not culture and art and society are interconstitutive. And Cândido has this very same proposition in which he said that the key in literary criticism is to see how the external elements, that is what Williams is calling society, right? The elements from the social historical context become internal. And last, because I want Hugo to talk too, and last but not least, they both share socialism, a very similar kind of socialism, and they also share a defense, a spirited defense of human value. There is a wonderful text by Cândido called The Right to Literature, in which he defends literature as one of the central human rights, because it allows you to organize your meanings and values. Can't you, if I told you that Raymond Williams had said that, would you be surprised? Right? No, you would say, of course, I haven't read it, but it must be somewhere, because it's the same spirit. And by that, again, I think this only proves the tenets of Marxist cultural theory, because the fact that they didn't read each other proves that our thoughts are the products of our social formations, right? If you are in Brazil, if you are in Great Britain, it is the same moment of the new left, as Hugo said. It's also a new left in Brazil. It's the same moment of rethinking materialist cultural criticism in more sophisticated terms than they used to be thought of. In my talk, I was talking about the differences between Williams's position in orthodox Marxism, right? And so I don't know if that answers your question, Daniel, but I think it is marvelous, right, to see that both Cândido and Raymond Williams share this same worldview, right? So I think, and translate this worldview into a very original, theoretical formulation. That's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's fascinating. Structures of feeling across the transnational space between us. Hugo, any thoughts on that?
I don't know. I was thinking about my own experience. I came from sociology, and thinking about sociology of culture in Brazil, it's interesting because in Brazil, the dominant figure is definitely Pierre Bourdieu. And it's interesting to see how we have now in the field of sociology of culture, many students reading and drawing to Williams as some sort of alternative, theoretical alternative from Bourdieu, especially the way Williams, as a different way to think the relations between cultural production and social formations, and as I see as a way that acknowledges the importance, the need of sociology to look more carefully at cultural productions. I don't know. I thinking on sociology of culture, I see this how Williams' work itself plays this role at putting in question selective tradition and considering this tradition of sociology of culture in Brazil very influenced by the French theories of Bourdieu.
Yeah, thanks, Hugo. And the idea of the habitus also speaks across. I know you've written on board here, partly based on your research at the archive in Swansea as well, Hugo, where there's some notes in French by Raymond Williams from a lecture he attended in France, which is quite interesting. There's a question here from Marianne Chow to everyone. Question for Hugo concerning Williams's definition of class. There's a clear difference between class as created and class in the objective condition, I guess the point I was making. Yes, is there any further criticism towards the separation between the two kinds of class by Williams? I guess Marianne is asking whether Williams makes that distinction, or does he elaborate on that distinction between class as an objective category and class consciousness, to use Lukasz's kind of phrase?
I think that this is a distinction which pervades much of his work, but more explicitly, more openly, I think Marxism and Literature, which is a book where he challenges more directly the Marxist tradition. And I think that there's, I'm pretty sure there is a chapter on class, and this is a piece of his work when we can find a more direct statements about this issue. Yes.
And Carla is asking you whether there's a connection between E.P. Thompson's conception. Are you familiar with Thompson's work on class, and Williams's thoughts on this?
Yes, definitely. The emphasis on the common culture, common practices, and I think this also reflects on their method of analysis. You know, both Williams and Thompson, they don't start from a given definition of class or a given definition of working class culture. Their analysis starts by analyzing and examining how these objects are built along history, you know, and are built as cultural and political practices. So it's impossible for them to define what working class culture is, or even what working class the British or the English or the Welsh working class is. You have to study it as a historical object. So I think there are central links between these two authors. The way they comprehend these issues, and the way they create a method to analyze them.
Yeah, I mean, you'll be aware of the debate in the 70s, or the more scientific, that new left that you were describing at the beginning of your paper, criticized Williams and Thompson really for being humanist, not sufficiently scientific and objective in their studies. Jerry Cohen's work in particular, argues, well, if there's such a thing as class consciousness, there's something you're becoming conscious of. So there is a base in that sense, an objective class of which the working class become conscious. What's interesting about Williams in that context might be that he's in some ways a bridge builder. E.P. Thompson thinks he's on his side. Perry Anderson thinks he's on their side. And this is a characteristic. It's a characteristic of his work. Yeah. Even in Culture and Society, the readings of even thinkers on the right, Burke, Arnold, Maria Eliza mentioned some of them. The readings are fairly generous in many ways. He is drawing on a wide range of resources, and in an age where we're kind of stuck in our silos, screaming at one another, he is a model in that respect. Carla, you had a longer question for Maria Eliza, and as you're here, do you want to ask it yourself?
Yeah, I can do that. Nice papers. It was nice to hear from both of you again. It's been a long time since we've been together. So I'd ask in the chat section, but I can repeat it. Maria Elisa, I was hearing you say about human value, how you like to recover that, that you think it's a central concept for Williams. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on that. If you see there's a big difference or uniqueness to Williams as opposed to other Marxist humanists, such as E.P. Thompson and others. And if you see that there's a difference or there are changes throughout Williams's career and how he sees these human values.
Thank you, Carla. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. And, Daniel was mentioning the discussions on the left. And I thought, Hugo, you were going to mention Thompson's review of Cultures Ordinary and the Long Revolution, in which he says to Williams, come on, culture is not a whole way of life, it's a whole way of struggle, right? And to which Williams characteristically responded, yes, of course, right? So, and he was a great bridge builder, right? And we really have to go back to building bridges. And, nowadays, science has changed me. I'll go to E.P. Thompson and human value in a minute, Carla. But, it's so funny to think, particularly of Althusserians, right, in Britain, and saying, and this defense of the science of Marxism. It's so funny because not even science defends itself as science anymore, right? So why should we worry about it, right? So one of my favorite essays in English is E.P. Thompson's The Poverty of Theory, because, there is a saying on television these days, which is called ultimate fighting, which is people fighting each other, fighters, UFC it's called. And it's organized by a crazy American called Dana White, and Hugo's laughing, saying, no, I can't believe she watches UFC. But anyway, and whenever I read The Poverty of Theory, that's exactly what I think. He's just pow, 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 and Althusser is lying on the ring, right? And he's been knocked out. And that gives me a lot of pleasure, Carla, because the difference is, of course, human value, right? What is important is to fight for human value. I'm sorry if I gave the impression that Williams uses this as a concept. I think I am the one who says it's a keyword in his work. I mean, you are much cleverer than me in finding things. So see if Williams has talked about, if he has used this expression, human value, not that I know of, but of course I don't know all his words by heart, but I know you can give a search command wherever it is that you give search commands to, and see that. So I think that is really a link between Williams and Thompson and all the humanist Marxists. And, they had very similar, I was talking about Antonio Cândido, he would be another one for our Human Value League, right? And I was thinking that Thompson and Williams had very similar experiences. They both taught at the WEA. They were both in the New Left Review. And also, I mean, there is a tone. I don't know if they learned that from William Morris, the 19th century British socialist, but there is a tone that is so similar, like William said of his father and his grandfather. The contexts are a bit different, but the language is the same. I still remember by heart the beginning of Thompson's great book, right? The Making of the English Working Class, that begins like, the working class did not rise like the sun. It was present at its own making. So that is valuing the human beings who are involved in a struggle, who are involved in building up new values, right? So I don't think Williams ever changed his emphasis on human values. He never bought the silly idea that theory and instruction are specializations. I think he adhered to the idea that culture is ordinary throughout his life. And culture is ordinary means, of course, culture is a thing that all human beings have, right? So I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's a fascinating discussion. There are some fairly knotty questions coming in late in the session.
Wonderful. I love that.
Well, I've timetabled the break for now. We're over time, and I'm sure people would like a break before the next session.